And the last gate is what I call ancestral grief. And the more I sit with this gate, the more I really begin to see how much our grief that I'm carrying, you're carrying, began, as Rumi would say, in some other tavern. It began generations ago and generations ago. So the grief I'm carrying in my body, which might feel very personal, like the shame I was given from my family and my church, well, where did they get it from? And where did they get it from? And where did they get it from? So what we're carrying right now is ancestral grief, generation upon generation upon generation. What in psychology, they talk about the transgenerational transmission of trauma. So multiple generations. There's a woman in Oakland, Joy DeGruy, who has done a tremendous amount of work studying what she calls post-traumatic slave syndrome, where she can see in the Black community here in the United States, 400 years of trauma in the way that they enact that today is evidence of that trauma beginning 400 years ago when the first slaves were brought to the United States. So we carry in our own DNA, psychically, emotionally, genetically, the traumas and grief of our ancestors.
Yeah.
So that's part of what we're carrying. And that trauma began partly because oftentimes, particularly for white Western culture here in the United States, because of a severing of a rich indigenous relationship to the land, to the language, to culture, to ritual, to place, which often was caused by traumatic relations where they were, threats, tyranny, violence, torture, oppression. So many of our ancestors had to flee, or like in Ireland, they felt the very hard oppression of the British Empire. So we're carriers of that trauma.
Yeah.
Beyond that here, and I think also perhaps in England, we're also the inheritors of, or the carriers of the ancestral grief around slavery, around what we did to the indigenous people here on this continent, which we have not atoned for, we have not reconciled. There's a lot of grief work to be done between the native inhabitants of this land and also the Black descendants of the slave culture. This is a lot of our grief work right now is
Yeah.
in this fifth grade of grief.
It reminds me of Bruce Parry. I don't know if you know this I guess anthropologist, broadcaster, and he went to a lot of different tribes and indigenous cultures around the world and lived with them. And one of the series he did was on drugs. So we'd go to different indigenous cultures and take their medicines. And one of the drugs, I forget what name it has, but it was in Africa. And what it supposedly does is it brings up the feelings in you, negative feelings that you caused in another person. And so he said he lived the most difficult night of his life when he took that drug. It was exactly as they described it to him. He just felt in his body what he caused other people to feel when he was acting out or being cruel or lost in his anger. And I guess that if that's real, that is what people are avoiding in the colonial cultures or the post-colonial cultures, who are still maybe benefiting from their genocides and the things they did. So it's painful. It's going to take some holding to give the love where people can feel they can confront that and have the warmth that you say is needed to transform it.
Yeah, yeah. It's going to take a lot of courage and a lot of patience as we fumble our way through this fifth gate. But it is more and more clear to me that this is, again, another place where so much of our grief work has to take place.
Yeah. And I guess the more we do the work on ourselves, then we develop the skills to be able to not be triggered by another's grief or another's trauma so much.
Yeah, because that phobia around it makes us very reluctant to stay open to it. I was at a racism workshop, I think I told the story in the book, some years ago, and just by the luck of how we were sitting, I was the last one to share in the opening circle. And when it was my turn to speak, I said, well, the issue I'm looking at most closely is this question of emptiness that I see in my culture. And a black man jumped out of his chair and pointed at me and said, that's it. Until you are willing to look at this as a people, you will continue to kill us and steal from us every single day.
Mm.
Part of my work, a part of white culture's work, is to recognize how deep this emptiness goes and how much we've relied upon supremacies of all kinds to try to fill that emptiness. Supremacy over nature, supremacy over other genders, supremacy over other races. This is how we have tried to mitigate against this feeling in our psyches that we are, in a sense, essentially empty, because we have abandoned all of what that deep ancestral inheritance was meant to support, which is, in a sense, living culture.